All right.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Maybe you had a chance to pop into GatherTown or just to grab some coffee, but we're delighted to have you here. In particular, I'm really excited to have Dr. Irina Rish give this next session. So Dr. Irina Rish is an associate professor in the Computer Science and Operations Department at the Université de Montréal and a core member of the Mila Quebec AI Institute. She holds master's and PhD degrees in AI from the University of California, Irvine, and her research focus is on machine learning, neural data analysis, and neuroscience-inspired AI. Before joining UDM and Mila in 2019, Dr. Rish was a research scientist at the IBM T.J. Watson Research Center, where she worked on various projects at the intersection of neuroscience and AI and led the Neuro AI Challenge. So a perfect speaker for this year's Maine 2020, and I'm so delighted that today she'll tell us a little bit about continual learning. With that, please take it away, Dr. Rish.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks for a great introduction. Yes, indeed, the topic of this kind of brief tutorial, high-level overview of that exciting field of continual learning. That's what I'm planning to talk about, and it's rapidly growing in AI community, but it also has its roots in neuroscience, because as you can easily imagine, continual learning is what people do all their lives, and that's where we would like to get with the machines, hopefully. I just start with a high-level overview of what our objectives can and should be, I guess, if we're really trying to achieve the artificial general intelligence, as many speakers, well, at least several, mentioned in the past several days. And one immediate problem that is recognized in the field is that despite all the amazing advances in particular areas such as game playing or picture generation, like basically the famous example of the GAN-generated painting that was sold at the auction in New York, and all this personal assistance and all the superhuman performance in playing Go and so on and so forth, and self-driving cars. The problem is that to achieve this performance, you usually just really need to focus on a particular narrow task, and you can get superhuman narrow AI, but you still do not have systems that can be truly versatile like people are, perhaps not being necessarily perfect at playing chess or Go, but being able to learn chess, learn Go, learn to drive a car, learn to paint a little, and keep learning new skills during their lifetime while not forgetting what they learned before. And another challenge related to that, which I'm just going to mention, but I'm not going to dig into detail later, is of course the notion of robustness, because those two come hand in hand. And by robustness, I mean the ability of AI systems to still perform well with respect to some sources of noise versus adversarial or maybe just statistical that usually people have no trouble dealing with. And there's classical examples from multiple papers, those pictures of cats where you add a little bit of adversarial noise, totally undetectable by human eye, and they break deep learning systems and make them misclassify cat as moped, and so on and so forth. There are numerous examples. There is a whole field of adversarial robustness where people try to do something about improving robustness of artificial neural networks to kind of catch up with the robustness of natural ones. As I mentioned, I mean, the robustness comes in very different forms, and one is being still able to work well in presence of some adversarial noise. Another related but different is non-adversarial, but rather the distributional shift and the classical out-of-distribution generalization challenge that seems to be really a holy grail in modern AI. And this classical example of cows on the green pastures as a data set given to the, given to classifier to train on, may lead system to very efficiently extract features that not necessarily relate to the object, the concept of cow and other animals, but they may just use features from the background, because artificial neural net doesn't really know what is invariant, robust, and inherent to the concept of an animal and what it should focus on, and what is a spurious correlation. So there is lots of work in the direction, like how to make sure that when you shift the system into a different setting, into different distributions, say cows on the beach, that it still performs well. And there are many, many different approaches recently, especially in the past several years, that trying to push our models and methods in the direction of being more invariant, robust, trying to extract, hopefully, causal features. And there were other talks on this topic, and I'm sure you enjoyed Joshua Benjo's talk yesterday. But bottom line is, this is really a problem, and this is something that we really need to solve if we would like to achieve closer to human level intelligence. And finally, well, last but not least, again, just at the high level of the properties that we would like our artificial systems to have, it's definitely the case that there is a huge conceptual gap between what our artificial neural networks look like and how they behave, and our human or even animal brains. And I'd like just to give you this food for thought, and I'm not saying that it's something that we can maybe solve that easily, but if you look at the artificial neural networks now that are trained as traditional statistical models with fixed set of parameters, that after you train them on particular data set, maybe even large one, and maybe many of them, but still you kind of converge to some set of parameters and fixed network. On the other hand, if you look at the brains, in this case, it's a famous calcium imaging data set for the larval zebrafish that many of you probably have seen before. You see that that network is constantly active, and it's not like it's learned something, fixed its parameters, and sitting there waiting for the next image to appear to classify it. Nothing like that. It's constantly interacting. The activity in different neurons is never stopping, whether you are in resting state, whether you show the input or not. But this is like live dynamical system, not just a fixed parametric statistical model. And then it's something that you may need to consider if you want to move to more powerful, more expressive and more functional systems. Basically, if you really want to move from current so-called narrow intelligence or weak AI to truly artificial general intelligence, and ideally to super intelligence, which is, of course, an interesting separate question to debate, and ethics is important here as well. But if you would like to move in this direction, at least the desiderata list is to be broad, not narrow, to be robust, not brittle, and hopefully to be more flexible and powerful like natural neural networks in terms of dynamics and other aspects that you can bring from neuroscience. And this is, of course, a big and exciting field, and the whole conference is essentially around this topic. So let me give you a brief introduction at the high level, and maybe later I'll just give you a few examples of approaches used in the field. But this exciting field that I mentioned called continual lifelong learning, and its difference from traditional machine learning setting of fixed training data set and test data set, and trying to learn some narrow task really well. So we humans definitely continue learning in different environments and like non-stationary data stream through our life. And that's a key assumption when you move from classical learning to continual or lifelong one. So essentially you assume, for example, in classification setting, that you will be observing multiple data sets or tasks, and you may or may not know which task you're given and when the task changes. There are many settings. I'll briefly mention some of them. But the bottom line is that continual learning is essentially online learning in a non-stationary environment. And you need to be prepared to learn your model through potentially infinite number of such environments. Of course, you can still assume that within each specific environment, your data samples are locally identically distributed, and that's kind of, they're coming from the same distribution, but then distribution changes, and those changes, as I said, may or may not be announced to you. One of the key problems in this field, not the only one, but historically kind of the most well-known, is so-called catastrophic forgetting. So what does it mean? Imagine a neural network that is trained by, say, stochastic gradient descent on a particular data set from a particular distribution. If you now switch to a new data set, then what usually happens, unless you take any measures, unless you really try to modify your algorithms, what usually happens is stochastic gradient may just follow the new data, the new trends and patterns, and essentially learn weights that will be good for the new data set, but not good anymore for the old one. And that is what's called catastrophic forgetting in machine learning field, and has long history in stability, plasticity, dilemma studies in neuroscience. I'll mention that also briefly. And example of that could be, you run this particular, well, there are a few classical algorithms for continual learning versus standard SGD here. And what you see in the picture on the right, indeed, is as you keep switching from task A to task B to task C, your performance of just plain vanilla standard neural net trained with SGD keeps degrading. The blue line keeps going down in terms of accuracy. You keep forgetting. Unless you employ particular approaches, and different approaches work better in different settings with different data sets. So EWC, for example, was one of the first and popular approaches proposed several years ago. And you can see that it was not forgetting as bad as a plain vanilla SGD did. So this is a classical example of where you would like to get with continual learning algorithms. Of course, continual learning is also closely related and has multiple intersections with other machine learning fields that share the notion of multiple environments or multiple different data distributions that you somehow want to be able to handle. The classical multitask learning also has a notion of multiple tasks where you would like to learn model that can handle all of them, but there is no online component to that. There is no model adaptation here. You're just training offline. Transfer learning is another well-known sub-area, also closely related, but again, there is no continuous adaptation. After learning the target task, you do not keep changing your model, trying to incorporate knowledge from all the previous tasks while adapting to the new one, and you do not assume it happening online. So on and so forth. Domain adaptation is also highly relevant and a very useful field to draw ideas from and explanations when doing anything with continual learning, and more of that needs to be done. But again, it's much simpler setting. It's unidirectional. You don't talk about necessarily catastrophic forgetting here, and there is no online component either. And of course, meta-learning is closely related. It does have the notion of adaptation, but again, it is offline. It assumes multiple samples of data sets that you draw from distribution over some data sets that you assume, and you pre-train your model on that to adapt faster on the new environments. But again, that is happening offline, and it's not kind of well suited for completely online lifelong kind of setting. Yeah, online learning is closely related, of course, but typically does not assume non-stationary inputs. So I really like this picture from the very nice tutorial on continual learning that we usually mention in my continual learning class, which gives you more specifically kind of taxonomy of different related approaches and how they similar and how they different from continual learning. So what I mentioned before is kind of just described here in more detail. And essentially, as I mentioned, for example, in meta learning, you have multiple tasks drawn from some distribution DT, and then from each task, from this data, you actually draw particular samples, but that happens offline as an example, and you meta learn a model that later on during the test time will be adapting to a new task. But so on and so forth, you can see that continual learning is the most challenging setting out of all these previously explored multi-task, multi-domain, multi-environment type of settings, because it combines this with online learning, and the challenge is you cannot really go back, and you cannot really have, well, you can potentially have all the data stored if the storage is cheap, but the access to this data will be expensive. So you assume that you will have to only learn looking forward, and you really cannot get back to the previous tasks whenever you want. There is a large taxonomy of methods, and it's still highly incomplete. Again, as I mentioned, it's really nice classification of those continual learning methods from the tutorial that I mentioned by Delange and colleagues. And roughly speaking, the methods for continual learning can be classified into three main categories. So the one category relies on keeping some form of memory about the past using replay methods. Either you try to select samples from the past data sets that in some sense would be most representative, or you try to maybe have generative models that can generate samples of the same kind as previous tasks were providing, or you try to constrain your weights so that those that were best for particular task will be kind of frozen or will change slowly, and the new ones more appropriate for the subsequent task will be changing more, and so on and so forth. So actually, I mean, this second type is more kind of fitting better into regularization-based approaches like EWC and so on. So replay methods, regularization-based approaches, and there are different names. You can call parameter isolation methods and so on, but essentially methods that include also dynamic architectures that allow your model to expand, to incorporate knowledge of new tasks while not forgetting, hopefully, the previous tasks. Anyway, so it's I just wanted to give you the idea that the set of methods is constantly expanding, and by no means this taxonomy is complete, and it's really a very fast-growing field. So to take a step back and just go and see what happens with catastrophic forgetting and other aspects in continual learning, I just wanted to show you an idea from our paper with Matt Riemer and my colleagues from IBM and MIT from the last year, which is very simple and kind of noticed in multiple other papers, of course. But the idea is that if you have, imagine two samples from old task and from the new task, what can happen here? when you train your model, and L is in this case your loss function, what situations may happen? You may actually have what's called transfer or positive transfer, in a sense that your gradient on the old sample and new sample in some sense is aligned, and therefore when you continue training model on the new sample, you do not interfere with the old one. And as simple as that. So basically your gradients are pointing in similar directions, or if it happens that that's not the case and they're pointing in the opposite direction and their product is negative, that's what can be called interference, and that's what can lead to catastrophic forgetting. Of course, I mean, this positive transfer or negative transfer interference, it can, in a sense, happen in both directions, and it doesn't always have to be that by learning the new task, you forget catastrophically the old one. Sometimes if there is synergy between the tasks, like this picture, you may actually improve performance on the previous task by learning the new one. But since it's not guaranteed, you need to be taking steps in order to minimize interference if you can, while also trying to maximize transfer. And this is like a very high level kind of schematic representation of what I was talking about. Essentially, you have your current model with certain weights, and this weight sharing, basically having the same weights that need to participate in solving previous task, current task, and future task. That's a problem that can lead to the so-called stability plasticity dilemma, as is well known in neuroscience literature. And your task is to kind of be aware of that problem and try to actually see what kind of modifications of the algorithm can help you maximize transfer while minimizing interference. And again, I'm sure there are many approaches. I just wanted to give one example, again, from that paper I mentioned on the meta experience replay. And essentially, the straightforward idea would be to augment your objective function, which is typically just a plain vanilla empirical risk minimization. You just say, I want my expected over the data that I will be getting from the given kind of data set. I want my expected loss to be minimized, but also I can say that how about we will require minimization of this interference or maximization of transfer by adding as a regularizer this product of gradients. And this idea used, as I said, in multiple other papers as well. And we would like to learn learn each example in a way that generalizes to other examples from overall distribution. So that's high-level idea, and how exactly you implement it, those approaches vary. In that particular meta experience replay paper that I just mentioned, well, I had to use some memory buffer, the replay, and because you cannot directly optimize for with respect to this whole offline stationary objective, it's not available. So you need to keep some samples from the past, and you maintain this partial history of past examples. You assume some limited size buffer, and you sample from that buffer to optimize this objective. And without going into too much detail, because I kind of just wanted to give you an idea of possible kind of ways of approaching this transfer versus interference type of a trade-off. And that particular method, we kind of based our approach on this experience replay, and we used meta learning basically based on reptile algorithm. And that was the modified objective, the actual objective that could be used, not the ideal one. Bottom line is that if you go along those lines, details, of course, in the paper and so on, you do seem to improve consistently your results as compared to several commonly used approaches like EWC and GM and some others. Anyway, so this is just to give you a flavor of the ideas and approaches that you can use in order to counteract that potential catastrophic forgetting issue, while also trying to learn so you will generalize better in the future. So there is much longer wish list of things we would like the ideal future continual learning system to have. And you definitely want ideally you would like to have some constant memory. If you have infinite data in task stream, even though that people say that memory is cheap, but again, if you want, say, your robot to work in different environments for really, really long time, perhaps infinite or really large memory requirements would be an obstacle. Also, in reality, you don't really know sometimes the task boundaries. For example, a robot moves from one room to another or goes outside, environment changed, but it's not necessarily the case that somebody keeps supervising that robot and telling the robot that environment change. It's his or her or its job to figure it out. And clearly, you want this learning to be happening online because, as I said, the offline training may not, or pre-training for everything may not be always available. Yes, as I mentioned, you would like good forward transfer, what you learn up to now. You want it to be generic enough so it will generalize well to future unseen and potentially quite different tasks, well, hopefully still having something in common with what you've seen before. So you want to also solve out of distribution generalization as a part of continual learning, and you want good backward transfer, at least not forgetting. And you want it, as I said, to be problem agnostic. In general, it might not be even always classification problem. You may need to sometimes switch to the regime when the labels are not available, and you just need to keep learning. So you need to learn representations that are good. And it might be also a reinforcement learning problem. I hope to mention that a little bit. And you need to be able to learn in various settings with missing information, such as semi-supervised and so on and so forth. So, and last but not least, forgetting might be okay, or compression, if it still allows you to perform sufficiently well on that task that you did in the past when you encountered in future, or at least you should be able to remember it quickly. So it doesn't necessarily have to be lack of forgetting, but at least it would be nice to have fast remembering. And given all these different settings in the current machine learning, current continual learning, the very classical, simplest, historically among the first ones was called task incremental, where you did have task boundaries given to you. That's the easiest case. An oracle tells you that you're now in the new task. And during testing, you also would be given samples and also task labels, so you know what you're trying to classify. There was a setting which is called rather like class incremental, similar, but during test time, you're not told from which task the samples come from, and it might be all the classes that were accumulated during your training time. And finally, more realistic, challenging setting, as I mentioned, task agnostic. Nobody tells you that task changes, and you need to keep learning. And during test time, you also will be given samples from potentially various different tasks, so on and so forth. And more recently, there were settings such as meta-continual learning. That's essentially a setting where continual learning is performed in meta way. So you have kind of multiple samples of the continual learning tasks, multiple such sequences. And just like in a classical meta learning, you're trying to train good initialization of your model, so that when in the test time you do encounter yet another continual learning setting or yet another sequence of environments, you can learn it quickly. And continual meta-learning, that's yet another relatively recently proposed kind of setting. It's meta-learning done in continual ways. So you have like periods of time when you kind of run meta-learning, and those happen in online non-stationary setting. Again, I might be probably running a little bit out of time, although I started later, but I just wanted to tell you that one of our recent works with my collaborators from Mila was precisely to try to come up with a more unifying framework that would include this fast adaptation and, well, fast adaptation and knowledge accumulation, the Osaka framework, which would actually unify classical settings of continual learning, including meta-continual and continual meta. And basically, again, details are in the paper, but indeed, that framework, as particular cases, implements just usual supervised learning or meta or continual, meta-continual and continual meta. So with this more unifying framework, you have much more flexibility, essentially. So you have the environment, which kind of really reminds more realistic setting for self-driving cars or for kind of autonomous robotics. And we assume that there are some stochastic shifts in the tasks or essentially data sets, and they are sampled from some distribution of those tasks. You don't know task boundaries, it's task agnostic. And yeah, so you can use several levels of non-stationarity here without going to details. Tasks can be revisited and will be, and you also evaluate your performance not on test time kind of set of data sets, but online, essentially like you do in reinforcement learning, like what is your overall online average performance. And again, without going into details about the setting, which I may not have time to cover, it's all in the paper. We utilize the classical meta-learning approach, or MAML, that famous and very, very kind of commonly used paper, where essentially the idea is that on a set of tasks that supposed to be available during pre-training time, you come up with a good parameter theta, which can serve as initialization to each particular new task when you start learning it, when you kind of pre-train your model, and then you want to very quickly adapt to new unseen tasks, while still hopefully coming from same distribution of tasks. So bottom line, we adapt the MAML algorithm to continual learning setting, we call it continual MAML, and we evaluate on various data sets where different aspects of the data change. For example, you can be pre-training on Omniglot, and then during continual learning, you have to work well on MNIST or fashion MNIST, or you use this another test bed like called symbols, and different things change about the images, fonts of the letters or the alphabets can change, and so on and so forth. Bottom line is that indeed with this framework, with this more generic framework and the continual MAML, we were indeed getting better results and state of art on various benchmarks, and details, of course, are in the paper. So given that I probably don't have much time left, even though we started later, I also wanted to mention, as before, I said that continual learning may happen in various settings, and though classification setting, the supervised continual learning was historically kind of the first and most commonly explored, there is also, first of all, lots of recent work in the domain of reinforcement learning. And also, if you think about that, reinforcement learning is kind of the most natural setting for online continual learning, if you assume that your data also kind of become non-stationary. And without going into too many details, I just wanted to mention that we're about to Hopefully very soon we're about to release the survey on continual reinforcement learning with my colleagues at Mila, Kime and Matthew, the Mila students, and with Irina. And that survey is an attempt to give you a snapshot of what's going on in the reinforcement learning field in terms of continual learning setting. And there is, of course, lots of activity in developing benchmarks. For example, the ProgGen environment for generating reinforcement learning tasks that are similar and yet vary in some aspects. So this would be really a perfect setting for non-stationary RL and for learning, basically for agent learning continuously, and so on and so forth. Finally, I just wanted to mention one example of where continual learning in the brain also may give you some inspirations for better approaches and better models. And that's, it's kind of a relatively old paper by now, but I kind of just like that example because it was indeed inspired by kind of adaptive behavior in the brain, not just in terms of adaptation of the links in the neural networks, not just the weights and links or synaptic adaptation. It was indeed an interesting phenomenon of adult neurogenesis, which is somewhat controversial and been like that for a while. But it was an interesting example where we tried to both come up with a very, very simple model that would hopefully confirm or not some empirical observations about why adult brains may still need neurogenesis. At the same time, it actually helped us to come up with algorithm which seemed to be well suited for continual learning. And essentially, what all we need to know is, yes, it seems like in very particular places in adult brains, and especially in hippocampus, and particularly dentate gyrus of it, in mammals, including humans, although it's much easier to test that it's happening in rats because you can just open their brains and look if they had new neurons being born given some experimental conditions. In humans, you have to do it very indirectly, but there is lots of empirical evidence, at least in rats and indirectly in humans, that there is still births of new neurons happening in adult brains in these areas. And bottom line, it seems to be very much related to the richness of environment and to changes, to non-stationarity of the environment to which animals or people are exposed to. So essentially, it looks like a continual learning setting if the different tasks or environments are sufficiently rich and different from each other, it seems to lead to more adult neurogenesis. So natural question was, can we have a simple model that could essentially explain what's going on? And the simplest model for hippocampus was historically just an autoencoder, again, without making things more sophisticated. And even if you look at classical sparse coding approach, the Holzhausen field, which later on was essentially formulated as sparse dictionary learning, and sparsity was imposed on the encodings or the basically vector of hidden units that correspond to the inputs and implemented using kind of a sparsity constraint L1. So classical sparse autoencoder, if you just use this simple model, but on top of that, you try to implement what kind of roughly corresponds to neurogenesis process. You allow new hidden units to be added, new neurons are born, but at the same time as we observe in experiments, well, as other people observe in experiments, new neurons only survive if they are kind of useful, if there are new and challenging tasks requiring, I guess, more capacity. So we had to kind of model the pressure to perform and kind of kill neurons that would have died if they are not used. So essentially it was kind of implemented with group sparsity, and you had this interplay between birth and death of these hidden units or neurons. And bottom line is, when you indeed test it in even simplistic continual learning setting, if you move environment from one type of images, like the city landscapes, for example, to the nature type of images, like animals and flowers, even that change actually was causing the standard approach not to learn as well as the neurogenetic one. So what we see here, that neurogenetic approach was able to represent and adapt to new images better. The blue line had a higher accuracy, but it also was not forgetting, it was actually even performing better on the previously seen images. So basically what I wanted to say, this example was an interesting story where neuroscientific observation and the empirical kind of question, like why do we need neurogenesis, and observation that it seemed to be happening more when we have naturally non-stationary environments, indeed translated into that performance by the method. So you both support the empirical observations in the neurogenetic literature, and you get a continual learning algorithm, at least for unsupervised case here, that seems to perform better. In any case, so I am about to conclude, and I just wanted to say that taking one step back from the kind of high level, you can continue the idea of neurogenesis, or you can continue the idea of expanding the architecture of your network while also compressing what's not needed. But the challenge is to come up with good approaches that can let you learn from potentially infinite set of tasks. And in supervised setting, you can say you're essentially classical machine learning task is to do function approximation, and continual learning task is to do good approximation with one model of infinite set of functions. So probably you need to assume some common properties that those functions coming from the same world and have something in common to share, otherwise you won't be able to learn them. But you will have to come up with some notion of functional basis, which is hopefully finite. So your network is finite, just like your brain, but they are in some sense encoding independent mechanisms that we hear about a lot these days. And those independent mechanisms or components can be combined or recombined to generalize to potentially infinite set of tasks. So how exactly you implement that, that's how different approaches kind of propose different techniques and so on. But that's the idea of extracting from continual learning observations the finite basis of quote-unquote orthogonal or independent mechanisms or basis functions to recombine them and represent any task you want in the future. That's what brain seems to be doing to some extent with areas that are specialized for certain tasks, but recombination of their and interaction between them lets you kind of do things in lifelong manner quite successfully. And finally, I just wanted to stop at this slide. Going in the future, it seems like it's important to think about interplay between environment complexity and representation capacity. And note that classical continual learning approaches right now are still not pushing towards really extremely different environments. They're typically imaging data sets, and the simplest example is rotated and perturbed amnesic. Less simple, just different image data sets and so on, but truly versatile system where different tasks and environments are drastically different. Indeed, from playing game to translating from language to language to generating images, the true drastic complexity of those environments will have to drive the increasing complexity of models and algorithms, and perhaps you might not be able to just change or add regularizer to SGD while staying with some fixed size neural network. You will have to perhaps expand your networks, expand and compress, and keep learning those components I mentioned. And perhaps if you really want to handle the true temporal complexity of the environment of the real world, you may potentially need to match it with a different type of models. As I mentioned in the beginning, you might need to implement some notion of network as a constantly active coupled dynamical system, and dynamics of that system will allow it to encode more inputs, because the time component gives you extra capacity. And without going into too much detail on that, I kind of leave it as a hypothesis. But I do think that we may need more expressive and richer models than currently existing neural network if we truly want to achieve continual lifelong learning with very, very different tasks. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for our brief but really beautifully comprehensive introduction to continual learning. There's a lot happening here, and it's really lovely to be able to hear from you about it. So I think, unfortunately, we're a little tight on time, so I think we really only have time for one question. And the question I want to ask you comes from Alex Hernandez Garcia, who asks, can you tell us a bit more about catastrophic forgetting in biological learning? Don't we humans also massively forget if we don't revisit related tasks? Maybe a reason to relax requirements for machine learning models.
Yes, yes, it's a very good question. Yes, and that's why I mentioned, I started with historically catastrophic forgetting was named the key issue in continual learning, but indeed, fast remembering is much more practical requirement than not forgetting. And yes, we do compress and we do forget, and it's absolutely necessary. So the question is what to forget and how to compress so that the system remains functional in the future for all kind of important tasks. And also revisiting previous tasks, ideally you should be able to remember how to do that, but you don't necessarily have to remember it from the top of your head. Like if I give you the test on functional analysis course you took, I don't know, 10 years ago, you might not be able to do it right away, but hopefully with a couple of days of preparation, you'll be able to do that. But if you never learned it before, you won't be able to remember fast. So you want to achieve that level of forgetting, compression, but being able to do fast remembering. So it's absolutely, it's a very good point. Yeah.
Great, and thank you so much again. I just want to vocalize that there's lots in the chat of thanking you for a really great talk.
I apologize, people asked for references. In any case, on my personal webpage, if you just Google me, the papers are there. The Osaka paper is from NeurIPS this year with Massimo and a bunch of other people from Mila. Paper with Matt Rimmer mentioned was from last year. Everything is on my webpage, yeah, or an archive. Yeah, so sorry I didn't give better references maybe in the slides, and I can share slides later if you'd like.
That would be great. I'm sure the slides were phenomenal, so I'm sure everyone would love to see those. And in the meantime, yes, we'll absolutely link to your website so they can get the references as well.
Or you can just ask me, yeah, if you need to.
Okay. Perfect. So thank you so much again. And we're really excited. We're going to move on to the next session. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.